The lead volunteer wiped grease off his forehead with the back of his wrist and said, loud enough for the small crowd of museum visitors to hear, "Folks, I'm going to level with you. 6 months, 4 mechanics, 2 so-called experts from a tank restoration shop in Ohio, and about $11,000 in parts later, this old girl is not going to start today either. I'm sorry. We'll keep trying." The visitors made disappointed noises and started drifting away from the roped-off area where the dusty olive-drab Sherman tank squatted on the concrete pad behind the County Military Museum. A couple of children groaned. A father in a baseball cap muttered something about coming back next summer. And from the back of the small crowd, leaning on a gnarled wooden cane, an old man in a faded denim jacket cleared his throat and said very politely, "Son, I do not want to step on any toes, but would you mind very much if an old man took a look at her?" The lead volunteer turned around, ready to politely turn the old gentleman away, the way he had politely turned away about 24 well-meaning grandfathers over the last 6 months. But something in the old man's face made him stop. The old man was not smiling the way the other grandfathers had smiled. He was not telling stories about a cousin who had served. He was just standing there, both hands resting on the curved top of his cane, his pale, watery eyes looking past the volunteer at the tank itself. And there was something in the way he was looking at it. Something that was not curiosity exactly, but more like recognition. The way you look at a face you have not seen in a very long time and are still not entirely sure you want to see again. The volunteer said slowly, "Sir, with respect, this is a pretty complicated piece of machinery, and we've had professional—" "Continental R975, the old man said quietly, 9-cylinder radial, 400 horsepower at 2400 RPM. She's a stubborn old girl when she's been sitting, and the magnetos are almost certainly your problem, but I would bet a week of my social security check that the real trouble is that nobody has primed the carburetors by hand. 9 cylinders, 9 carburetors, and you cannot prime them from the driver's seat. You have to do it from inside by feel, and you have to know exactly how much fuel each one wants. May I take a look?" The lead volunteer's mouth opened slightly. He looked at the old man. He looked at the tank. He looked back at the old man. And he said, in a voice that had gone suddenly very small, "Sir, who are you?" If you believe that the old men leaning on canes in the back of every crowd are almost always carrying secrets the rest of us cannot imagine, type the word legend in the comments right now, because what was about to happen on that concrete pad behind a small county museum in central Tennessee was going to make every person watching question everything they thought they knew about old men and old machines. His name was Clarence Whitaker, and at 80 years old he was the oldest active member of the Friday Morning Coffee Club at a small diner in a town called Marlow Springs, 22 miles down the road from the county museum where the Sherman tank had sat rusting for the better part of 3 decades. Clarence had driven up to the museum that morning because his great-granddaughter Lily, who was 9 years old and obsessed with anything that had treads or wings or guns, had asked him for the 3rd time in a row to take her to see the tank. Lily was at school today. It was a Tuesday, and Clarence had not actually planned to come on a Tuesday. But Lily's mother had mentioned at Sunday dinner that the museum was supposed to fire the tank up on Tuesday for the local newspaper, and that Lily was going to be heartbroken to miss it. Clarence had decided, sometime around 3 in the morning, when he was lying awake the way old men lie awake, that he would drive up to the museum himself, watch the tank start, take some photographs on the small disposable camera his daughter had bought him for his last birthday, and bring the photographs back to show Lily after school. That had been the plan. Clarence had not expected to see what he was now seeing, which was a half-dozen volunteers in coveralls covered in grease and sweat and visible despair, standing around a tank that was not going to start, while a small crowd of disappointed visitors prepared to go home. Clarence was a thin man, not frail but compact, the way men who have done a lot of work in cramped spaces tend to be compact. He stood 5'7" on a good day, and weighed maybe 145 pounds soaking wet. His hair was the colour of fresh snow, and was cut once a month at the same barbershop he had used since he and his late wife Margaret had moved to Marlow Springs in 1972. His hands were knotted and freckled and bore 3 faded tattoos he had gotten in Naples, Italy, in February of 1944, a small cross on his left forearm, an anchor on his right forearm, and on the back of his right hand, the number 743, which was the designation of the tank battalion he had served in for almost 2.5 years, across North Africa and Sicily and Italy and France and Germany, and finally into Czechoslovakia at the very end of the war. The tattoos were so old that the ink had spread under his skin and the numbers were soft around the edges, but you could still read 743 if you looked at his hand for more than a second. And that was the kind of detail Clarence had stopped explaining to people about 30 years ago, because the explanation always took longer than the telling, and most people did not really want to know. He walked with a wooden cane that he had carved himself, in his garage, in the long, slow autumn after Margaret had died of pneumonia in 2018. The cane was made of black walnut from a tree on his own property, and the handle was shaped like the curve of a Sherman tank's commander's hatch. A detail nobody who looked at the cane had ever recognised, because nobody who looked at the cane had ever spent any time inside the turret of a Sherman tank in 1944. The County Military Museum sat on 5 acres of donated land at the edge of a small town called Bridgeford, and it was the kind of museum that exists in many small American counties: a single low brick building, a parking lot for maybe 40 cars, a flagpole, and a fenced outdoor display area containing, in this particular case, 1 Sherman tank, 2 field artillery pieces from the Korean War, a Vietnam-era Huey helicopter that had been converted into a static display, and a small concrete monument with the names of the county's war dead, carved into it from World War I forward. The museum was run mostly by volunteers, retirees from the surrounding farms and small towns, who had decided that preserving the county's military history was a worthwhile way to spend their twilight years. The lead volunteer that morning was a man named Gerald Pence, 62 years old, a retired diesel mechanic from a long-haul trucking company, and Gerald had spent the last 6 months of his life increasingly obsessed with the Sherman tank in a way that his wife had begun to find slightly worrying. The tank had been donated to the museum in 1994 by the estate of a local farmer who had brought it home from a military surplus auction in 1959 and had let it sit in a barn for 35 years. When the museum had received it, the tank was in surprisingly good cosmetic condition. The original paint, the original markings, the original tools still strapped to the hull. But the engine had not been turned over since approximately 1962, and the tank had been displayed as a static exhibit for the next 30 years without anyone seriously attempting to restore it to running condition. 6 months ago, Gerald had decided that the museum needed a working tank for its annual Veterans Day open house, and he had recruited 4 other volunteers, all retirees, all reasonably handy, none of them with any actual experience working on a wartime radial engine, to help him bring the Sherman back to life. The project had not gone well. They had drained and replaced fluids, they had cleaned the spark plugs, they had rebuilt the magnetos, they had ordered a new ignition harness from a supplier in Pennsylvania at a cost of $1,900. They had cranked the engine over with a fresh battery, and had gotten nothing but slow, sad rotations and the occasional cough of unburned fuel out the exhaust. They had brought in the 2 so-called experts from Ohio, who had charged the museum $4,000 between them, and had left with diagnostic notes and a vague promise to follow up. Nobody had followed up. And this morning, with the local newspaper photographer scheduled to arrive at 11 o'clock, Gerald Pence had been forced to admit, in front of about 15 disappointed visitors, that the Sherman tank was not going to start today either, and that the Veterans Day open house in 3 weeks was probably going to feature the same dead, immobile tank it had featured for the last 30 Veterans Days. And it was at exactly that moment that the old man in the denim jacket had cleared his throat and asked, very politely, if he might take a look. Gerald Pence stared at Clarence Whitaker for a long 3 seconds. Then he said, in the careful tone of a man who is trying not to insult anybody, "Sir, can I ask, have you worked on tanks before?" Clarence considered the question. He looked down at his cane. He looked at the tattoo on the back of his right hand, the soft, blurred 743 that almost nobody ever asked him about. Then he looked up at Gerald and said, "I drove one for 31 months. I commanded one for the last 14 of those months. I have personally hand-cranked a Continental R975 to life in temperatures of negative 12 degrees Fahrenheit in the Ardennes forest in January of 1945, and I have done it in a sandstorm in Tunisia in April of 1943, and I have done it under enemy artillery fire on at least 4 occasions that I can recall without thinking too hard about it. I am not a mechanic by trade. I went into shoe sales after the war, if you can believe that. But I will tell you this. The Continental R975 is not a complicated engine. It is a stubborn engine. There is a difference. And the men who built her in a factory in Muskegon, Michigan, in 1943 and 1944, built her to be started by a frightened 19-year-old kid with frozen fingers in the middle of a battle, which means there is a way to start her without diagnostic equipment and without computer scanners and without $4,000 worth of consultants from Ohio. May I take a look? Gerald Pence's mouth was open. His 4 fellow volunteers had stopped what they were doing and were now standing in a small semicircle around Gerald and Clarence listening. The remaining visitors who had not yet drifted back to the parking lot were turning around and coming back. Word was spreading through the small crowd in the way word always spreads in small crowds, by elbows and whispers, and the unmistakable feeling that something interesting was about to happen. Gerald, who had been a diesel mechanic for 38 years, and who had also been raised by his grandfather to respect his elders, made a decision. "Sir," he said, "I would be honoured to have you take a look. What do you need?" Clarence smiled. A small, dry, slightly tired smile, the smile of a man who had not expected to be doing this today and who was now doing it anyway. "I need somebody to help me up onto the deck," he said, "because my knees are not what they used to be, and I am 80 years old, and I am not too proud to admit that I cannot climb up there alone the way I used to. I need somebody to hand my cane up to me after I'm inside the turret, because I am going to need it to push myself back up out of the hatch when I'm done, and I need somebody to bring me about a quart of fresh gasoline in a clean container, and a small flathead screwdriver, and a clean cotton rag, and one of those long-stem oil cans with the squeeze pump on the bottom, the kind with a flexible spout. That is all I need. The rest of it is in the tank, where it has been waiting for somebody who knows where to look." 2 of Gerald's volunteers, both younger and stronger than Gerald himself, helped Clarence climb up onto the front glacis plate of the tank. It was a slow process. Clarence's knees protested at every step, and he had to pause twice to catch his breath, but he refused to let either of the volunteers actually lift him. "I will get up there under my own power, gentlemen, even if it takes me 10 minutes. Once he was on the deck, he made his way carefully across the top of the hull to the commander's hatch on the turret. He paused there for a long moment, one hand resting on the rim of the hatch, and his face did something that everyone watching would later try to describe, and none of them would quite manage. It was not a smile, and it was not a frown. It was the expression of a man who had stepped, after 65 years away, back into a room he had once known better than his own bedroom. He looked down into the dark interior of the turret. He took a breath, and then he lowered himself, slowly, painfully, his bad knees screaming through the hatch and into the gunner's compartment, and from there sideways into the driver's seat of a Sherman M4A1 tank that had not been operated by a competent crew member since the spring of 1945. The fit was tight. The Sherman had been designed for men who were, on average, much smaller than modern men, and Clarence at 5'7" was almost exactly the size of the men the tank had been built for. He settled into the driver's seat as if he had just gotten up from it for a coffee break. Gerald Pence handed the wooden cane down through the hatch, and Clarence took it and propped it against the bulkhead next to him, where it could not slide around. Then Clarence closed his eyes for a moment and put both of his old, freckled, knotted hands flat against the inside of the hull, the way a man might press his palms against the wall of a house he had grown up in, and he said very quietly, so quietly that nobody outside the tank could hear him, "Hello, old girl, it has been a long time. I am sorry I did not come back sooner. I am here now. Let us see if you remember me." And then he opened his eyes and got to work. The first thing Clarence did was something that none of the 4 volunteers and neither of the 2 so-called experts from Ohio had ever thought to do, because it was not in any of the manuals they had been reading, and it was not part of any modern restoration procedure. He reached forward and to his right, into a small recessed cubby that the museum visitors did not even know existed because it was hidden behind a panel that swung open on a hinge, and he pulled out a small oil-stained leather pouch that had been sitting in that cubby since approximately April of 1945. The pouch contained 4 things: a folded square of wax paper, a small steel funnel, a length of clean rubber tubing about 8 inches long, and a handwritten index card with notes in faded pencil in a young man's handwriting. Clarence looked at the index card for a long moment, and his throat worked once. The handwriting on the card was his own. He had written the notes himself in the back of a ruined French farmhouse in November of 1944, after one of the other commanders in his battalion had taught him a particular trick for cold starting the R975 in extreme weather, and he had stuck the card in the leather pouch and forgotten about it within 6 months. The card had been sitting in the cubby of this exact tank for 80 years, waiting for the only man who would have known to look for it. And Clarence Whittaker was looking at his own 19-year-old handwriting through 80-year-old eyes, and for a moment the inside of the turret blurred slightly. He cleared his throat. He folded the card carefully and put it in the breast pocket of his denim jacket. Then he called up through the hatch, "Gerald, I am ready for the gasoline and the oil can, and I am going to need somebody to bring me a fully charged battery in about 10 minutes, but not yet. I have to do the priming first." Gerald passed down the supplies through the hatch one item at a time. Clarence took each one and arranged them on the floor next to the driver's seat, with the unhurried precision of a man who had done this exact sequence hundreds of times before. Outside the tank, the small crowd had grown to maybe 40 people now, because word had passed along the museum grounds that an old man had climbed inside the dead Sherman and was going to try to start it. The museum's part-time docent, a woman named Eileen, had walked outside to see what was happening, and when she saw the old man's denim jacket disappearing into the hatch, she had immediately gone back inside and called the museum's director on his cell phone, and the director, a man named Walter Briggs, who happened to be at his dentist's office that morning, had told Eileen to call him back the second anything interesting happened. And inside the turret of the Sherman, Clarence Whittaker, who had not done this in 80 years, was about to do it from muscle memory. The Continental R975 was a 9-cylinder, air-cooled radial engine that had originally been designed by the Wright Aeronautical Corporation as an aircraft engine in the 1920s, and had been adapted for use in tanks at the beginning of the Second World War because the Allies were desperate for any engine they could mass-produce that would fit into the cramped engine compartment of a medium tank. The R975 was a temperamental engine even when it was new. It was air-cooled, which meant it ran hot in summer and was hard to start in winter. It was a radial design, which meant that when the tank was sitting still, the lower cylinders gradually filled with engine oil that drained down by gravity from the upper cylinders, a phenomenon called hydraulic lock that would shatter a connecting rod if you tried to crank the engine without first manually rotating it through several full turns to clear the oil. It had 9 separate carburetors, one for each cylinder, and each carburetor had to be primed individually before a cold start, because the fuel pumps on a 1944 Sherman were not strong enough to push raw gasoline through cold lines fast enough to feed the engine on the first crank. And it had a starting procedure that, if you got it wrong in any of about a dozen specific ways, would either flood the engine, foul the spark plugs, crack a piston, or simply do nothing at all. The young men who had been trained to operate Shermans in 1942, 1943 and 1944 had learned this procedure by repetition, by failure, by the patient instruction of older sergeants who had learned it themselves the same way. By the end of his 14 months as a tank commander, Clarence Whittaker had been able to start a cold R975 in under 4 minutes from the moment he climbed into the driver's seat, and he had been able to do it without thinking about any of the steps consciously, the way a concert pianist plays a piece he has memorized at age 6. He had not done it in 80 years, but the muscle memory was still there, the way the muscle memory of riding a bicycle is still there in a man who has not been on a bicycle since childhood. And Clarence's hands began to move through the sequence on their own, and his conscious mind followed along with a kind of detached fascination, the way a man watches his own hands shuffle a deck of cards he has not held in decades. First, the manual rotation. Clarence reached forward and engaged the hand crank that allowed the engine to be turned over slowly without firing, and he rotated the engine through 5 complete revolutions to clear any pooled oil from the lower cylinders. He counted under his breath. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then he stopped, listened, and rotated 3 more times to be sure. The engine turned smoothly. There was no oil lock. Good. Then the priming. Clarence took the oil can full of gasoline and the rubber tubing and the small funnel from his arrangement on the floor, and he began to feed measured amounts of fresh fuel through specific access points into each of the 9 carburetors in turn, working entirely by feel, because the priming ports were not visible from the driver's seat, and you had to find them with your fingers in the dark. He primed cylinder 1. He primed cylinder 2. He worked his way around the radial, his old hands moving through the cramped space with a precision that the watching volunteers, who could see only flashes of his denim sleeve through the open hatch, could not see but could somehow feel. It took him about 6 minutes to prime all 9 carburetors, and the entire time he was murmuring something under his breath that sounded almost like a prayer, but that the volunteers eventually realised was Clarence quietly counting in cadence, the way a young man counts when he's doing something he was taught to do under pressure, and the cadence is the only thing keeping him calm. When he was done with the priming, he set the oil can carefully on the floor and called up through the hatch, "Gerald, bring the battery, and I need somebody at the front of the tank with their hand on the master fuel cutoff valve, ready to close it the instant I tell them to in case she catches and runs away on me. Do you have anybody who knows where the fuel cutoff is?" One of the younger volunteers, a bearded man in his 30s named Travis, called out, "Sir, I've been reading the manual for 6 months. I know exactly where it is. I've got it." "Good. Stand by it. Do not close it unless I yell. Do not close it on your own initiative. Wait for my voice. Are we clear?" "Yes, sir." The battery was lowered through the hatch, and Clarence connected it with the unhurried care of a man who knew that connecting a battery wrong on a Sherman tank could ruin a perfectly good morning very quickly. He checked the connections twice. He checked the fuel selector. He checked the throttle position. He checked the choke. He checked the magneto switches and set them both to on. He pulled a small lever near his right knee that he had not actually looked at in 80 years, but that his hand found in the dark on the first try. He took a breath. He looked at the index card in his breast pocket through the fabric of his jacket. Not at it exactly, but in its direction, the way a Catholic might glance toward a small medal under his shirt before doing something difficult. And he said, out loud, in a voice loud enough to carry up through the hatch to the people standing outside, "All right, old girl, let us see if you remember how to do this. 3, 2, 1, and he hit the starter. There was a long, slow, grinding noise from the rear of the tank, a wheezing, mechanical, metallic groan that sounded for a moment exactly like every other failed start the volunteers had been listening to for the last 6 months. Gerald Pence's heart sank. Travis at the fuel cut-off valve closed his eyes. The crowd watching from outside the rope barrier let out a small collective sigh of disappointment. And then, from somewhere deep inside the engine compartment, there was a single, sharp, percussive bang, like the sound of a heavy door being slammed in a far room, and a small puff of pale blue smoke shot out of the exhaust pipe at the rear of the tank, and the slow grinding noise hesitated, hiccuped, and was suddenly replaced by a deep, rattling, lopsided cough, as one cylinder, then 2, then 4, then 6, then all 9 of the Continental R975 cylinders caught fire one after another in a rolling cascade of combustion. The engine, which had not produced a single full revolution under its own power since the early 1960s, came to life with the deep, throaty, unmistakable roar of a wartime radial. The volunteers around the tank actually staggered backward. Gerald Pence's hands went up to the sides of his head as if he were holding it on. Travis at the fuel cutoff started laughing in a way that sounded suspiciously like crying. The crowd outside the rope barrier let out a sound that was half cheer and half gasp, and a child somewhere in the back screamed in delight, and the local newspaper photographer who had just arrived in the parking lot dropped his coffee on the asphalt and started running toward the tank with his camera bag bouncing against his hip. Inside the turret, Clarence Whitaker sat in the driver's seat of the Sherman, with his hands resting lightly on the controls, listening to the engine, and the engine was rough. It was running on 9 cold cylinders. It had not been properly tuned in 8 decades. The timing was almost certainly slightly off. But it was running, and Clarence was making minute adjustments to the throttle and the mixture by feel, the way a man rocks a baby he has not held in years, and slowly, over the next 90 seconds, the rough lopsided cough of the engine smoothed out into a steady, rolling, beautiful rumble that sounded the way the engine of a Sherman tank had sounded in 1944, and Clarence Whitaker, 80 years old, sitting in the driver's seat of an M4A1 medium tank in Bridgeford, Tennessee, on a Tuesday morning in October, closed his eyes and let 2 slow tears run down the lines of his weather-worn face, because the last time he had heard this sound, the man sitting in the gunner's seat next to him had been a 19-year-old kid from Akron, Ohio, named Eddie Pavlovich, and Eddie had not lived to see his 20th birthday. Gerald Pence climbed up onto the deck of the tank with the agility of a man 20 years younger than he actually was, and he leaned over the open hatch and looked down into the turret, and he saw the old man in the denim jacket sitting in the driver's seat, with his eyes closed and his hands on the controls and his face wet, and Gerald did not say anything for almost 10 seconds. He just looked. Then he said very quietly, so that only Clarence could hear him over the rumble of the engine, "Sir, take all the time you need. We're not in any hurry, please. Take all the time you need." Clarence opened his eyes. He looked up through the hatch at Gerald's face, framed against the bright Tennessee sky, and he nodded once. Then he reached up his hand and Gerald took it, and Gerald helped Clarence ease himself up into a half-standing position so that his head and shoulders came up through the commander's hatch, and he could see the small crowd of people standing around the tank, looking at him as if he had just walked on water. The crowd was completely silent now, except for the deep, rolling rumble of the R975. There were maybe 60 people there. The local newspaper photographer was on one knee about 15 feet from the tank, his camera held to his eye, but he was not actually taking pictures yet, because something in his journalist's instinct was telling him that this was not a moment to be interrupted by the click of a shutter, and Clarence Whitaker, with his head and shoulders sticking up out of the commander's hatch of the only Sherman tank he had operated since 1945, looked out at the crowd, and the crowd looked back at him, and for a long moment nobody said anything at all. Then Clarence said, in a voice that was not loud but that carried through the air over the engine the way certain voices do, "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Clarence Whitaker. I served in the 743rd Tank Battalion of the United States Army from January of 1943 until June of 1945. I drove a tank exactly like this one across North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, Belgium, Germany, and into Czechoslovakia. The tank I drove was named Hattie May, after the woman my crew chief was engaged to marry, and Hattie May took 6 direct hits during the war, lost 3 different transmissions, had her main gun barrel replaced twice, and brought every man in my crew home alive except for one. His name was Eddie Pavlovich. He was 19 years old. He was killed by a sniper in a village in eastern Germany on April 14, 1945, 23 days before the war ended in Europe. He died in the gunner's seat of Hattie May with my hand on his shoulder. I've not sat in the driver's seat of a Sherman tank since I climbed out of Hattie May for the last time in a vehicle park outside of Pilsen, Czechoslovakia on June 2, 1945. I did not expect to ever sit in one again. I came here this morning because my great-granddaughter Lily wanted to see this tank start. She's 9 years old. She's at school today. I'm going to tell her tonight that the tank started because her great-grandpa knew how to do it, and she is going to think I am the coolest old man in central Tennessee, and I am going to let her think that, because she is 9 years old and she deserves to think her great-grandpa is cool. But the truth is that the tank started because the men who built her in a factory in Michigan in 1943 built her to start, and because the men who taught me how to operate her in a training camp in Kentucky in 1943 taught me how to do it in a way that you do not forget no matter how many years go by, and because the engine of a Sherman tank is a forgiving engine if you treat her with respect and you remember that she is older than you are, and she has been waiting a long time. I am very honoured to be standing here this morning. I would like to thank Mr. Pence and his volunteers for the work they have done on this tank. They were closer than they realised. Sometimes the last 6 inches of a long road is the hardest part, and somebody has to come along who has walked that road before to show you where the next step is. That is all I am, ladies and gentlemen, a man who has walked this road before. Thank you for letting me show you the next step. And then Clarence Whitaker, 80 years old, stood in the commander's hatch of an M4A1 Sherman tank in Bridgeford, Tennessee, and he raised his right hand to his forehead in a slow, careful, 8-decade-old salute that he had not given since June of 1945. And he held it, and the crowd of 60 people on the concrete pad behind the small county military museum stood at a kind of unconscious attention, and the local newspaper photographer finally lifted his finger to the shutter button and took the photograph that would, 3 days later, run on the front page of every newspaper in the state of Tennessee under a headline that read, "He never forgot." It took the 4 volunteers about 15 minutes to help Clarence get back out of the tank, because his knees had stiffened up from sitting in the cramped driver's compartment and his back was in worse shape than he had let on, and Gerald Pence had to climb down into the turret and physically support Clarence's weight from below, while Travis and another volunteer named Bill pulled him up through the hatch from above. Clarence laughed about it in a quiet, embarrassed way the whole time, and he kept apologising for being old, and Gerald kept telling him to stop apologising, and at one point Clarence said, "Gerald, I want you to know something. Climbing into a Sherman tank in 1944 at the age of 19 was the easiest thing in the world. Climbing into one in 2025 at the age of 80 is one of the hardest things I've ever done, and climbing back out of one is harder than climbing in. I have new respect for every old man who ever told me he could not do something physical. I used to think most of them were exaggerating. I now know that none of them were." When Clarence was finally back on solid ground, with his cane in his hand and his denim jacket dusty and his face streaked with tears and engine grime, He looked back at the tank, which was still rumbling away on the concrete pad, and he said, "Gerald, turn her off when you're ready. Do not run her too long the first day. Let her warm up for about another 5 minutes and then shut her down and let her cool. You can run her again in a few hours. Do that for 2 or 3 days, 10 or 15 minutes at a time before you ask her to do anything more strenuous. She's been asleep for a long time and you have to wake her up gently, the way you wake up an old dog. Do not start moving her around the property until she has had at least a week of just running in place. And when you do start moving her, take her in straight lines first. Do not try to turn her until you have driven her in straight lines for at least 2 days. She will tell you when she's ready. You will know." Gerald nodded, taking mental notes. Travis, who had been holding the fuel cut-off and who was now standing about 3 feet from Clarence with an expression that could only be described as awe, said, "Sir, how did you do that? 6 months. 6 months we worked on this thing. 2 professional restoration guys. You came in here and did it in 30 minutes. Clarence smiled at him gently. "Son, I did not do it in 30 minutes. I did it in 2.5 years. The 30 minutes was just the part you watched. The 2.5 years was every day I spent with this engine, and engines exactly like it from January of 1943 until June of 1945, and the thousands of hours I spent watching older men start them and listening to older men talk about them and learning every cough and rattle and noise this engine makes when she is happy and when she is unhappy. You cannot get those 2.5 years out of a manual. You cannot get them from a consultant in Ohio. You can only get them from time and from being scared enough to pay close attention and from having an instructor who's been there before. The men who taught me how to start a Sherman tank were teaching me a thing they had learned in a place where, if you got it wrong, somebody died. That kind of teaching sticks. It sticks for 80 years. It would stick for 180 years if I could live that long, which I cannot." Travis was nodding without saying anything. The newspaper photographer, who had now moved closer and was openly taking pictures, asked Clarence if he could ask him a few questions for the article, and Clarence said yes, but only if they could sit down somewhere because his legs were tired. Gerald led them all into the small museum building and brought Clarence a folding chair and a glass of cold water, and the photographer pulled out a small notebook, and the interview that followed was, the photographer would later tell his editor, the most extraordinary 45 minutes of his 15-year journalism career. What none of them knew yet, and what the article in the newspaper would not get around to revealing for several more days, was that Clarence Whitaker was not just any old Sherman tank veteran. He was, as far as the records indicated, one of fewer than 300 surviving United States Army tank crewmen who had served in continuous combat from North Africa in 1943 through the end of the war in Europe in 1945, and he was one of fewer than 50 surviving tank commanders from his cohort. He had been awarded the Bronze Star with Valor Device for an action in the Hurtgen Forest in November of 1944, in which he had, against orders, reversed his disabled tank back into a kill zone to recover the wounded crew of a friendly tank that had been hit by German anti-tank fire. He had been awarded the Silver Star for an action near a village in Czechoslovakia in May of 1945, in which he had personally accepted the surrender of an entire German company by climbing out of his tank and walking unarmed across an open field with both hands raised, because his radio had been shot out and he had no way to communicate his intention except by walking. He had 3 Purple Hearts, none of which he had ever displayed in his home, all of which was sitting in a small wooden box in the top drawer of his bedroom dresser in Marlow Springs, along with the discharge papers and the unit pictures and the letters from the parents of Eddie Pavlovich, who had written to Clarence in 1946 to thank him for the letter he had sent them about Eddie's death, and who had become regular correspondents of his for the next 20 years, until Eddie's mother had died in 1967. Clarence had never spoken at a school. He had never spoken at a Memorial Day ceremony. He had never joined the local American Legion or VFW post, although he sent them a small donation every year. He had never put a 743rd Tank Battalion sticker on his car. He had never worn a veteran's hat. He had spent 80 years living the quietest possible life a man could live with the kind of history Clarence Whitaker carried, and the only people in his entire town who knew anything at all about his service were his daughter, his grandson, his great-granddaughter Lily, and one other man, a retired Methodist minister named Reverend Lyle Holcomb, who had himself been a B-17 navigator over Germany in 1944 and 1945, and who had been Clarence's closest friend in Marlow Springs for 42 years, until Reverend Holcomb had died of congestive heart failure in 2021. Clarence did not talk about the war. He had never talked about the war, and the reason Clarence had finally today said as much as he had said standing in the commander's hatch of that Sherman tank, about Eddie Pavlovich, about Hattie May, about the day he had climbed out of his tank for the last time in 1945, was that something about the sound of the R975 firing back to life had pulled the words out of him before he could think about whether he wanted to say them, and once they were out he did not want them back, because he had spent 80 years not saying them, and he was tired suddenly of not saying them. And Eddie Pavlovich had been dead for 80 years, and the only thing Clarence had ever been able to do for Eddie was to remember him, and remembering him out loud, finally in front of strangers, had felt like the kind of thing Eddie would have appreciated. The photographer's article appeared in the local newspaper 3 days later. The headline read, "He Never Forgot," and the front-page photograph showed Clarence Whitaker in the commander's hatch of the Sherman tank, his right hand raised in a salute, his face streaked with engine grime and tears, with the rolling Tennessee hills behind him and the morning sun catching the white of his hair. The article was picked up within 48 hours by a regional news service, and from there it spread across the country in the slow, organic way that good stories spread, passing from one local newspaper to another, then onto a few veterans' organisation websites, then onto social media, where it accumulated millions of views over the course of the following 2 weeks. By the end of October, Clarence Whitaker had received personal letters from a retired 4-star general in Florida, from the curator of the Patton Museum at Fort Knox, from the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, and from the granddaughter of Eddie Pavlovich, who lived in a suburb of Cleveland, Ohio, and who had spent her entire life knowing only that her great-uncle Eddie had died in a tank in Germany in April of 1945, and that there had been a man named Whitaker who had written her great-grandparents a long, careful letter about it, but whose first name and current location her family had lost track of decades ago. Eddie Pavlovich's great-niece, her name was Rachel Pavlovich Sandoval, she was 34 years old, she taught 3rd grade in a Cleveland suburb, drove 8 hours straight to Marlow Springs, Tennessee, the weekend after she received the article from her aunt, and she knocked on Clarence Whitaker's front door at 4 p.m. on a Saturday with no warning, and when Clarence opened the door she said, "Mr. Whitaker, my name is Rachel Pavlovich, and my great-uncle Eddie was the boy who died in your tank, and I have spent my whole life wanting to thank you for the letter you wrote my family in 1945, and I am so sorry to show up at your door without calling, but I did not know how to call, and I needed to come and I am here, and if you would like me to leave I will leave, but I needed you to know that we still have the letter, and we still read it every year on April 14th, and we still love you for writing it." Clarence Whitaker stood in his doorway looking at the young woman on his front porch, and his hands started shaking, and he opened the door wider, and he said, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, "Eddie Pavlovich's great-niece. My God, come in, child, come in, I have something I want to show you." And he led Rachel into his small living room, and he opened the bottom drawer of an old oak cabinet, and he pulled out a small leather-bound photograph album that nobody in his family had ever seen, and inside the album, on the very first page, was a black-and-white photograph of 5 young men in tanker overalls standing in front of a Sherman tank with the name Hattie May painted on the side, and the second man from the left was Eddie Pavlovich, smiling at the camera in the spring of 1945 in a town somewhere in eastern Germany, 3 weeks before his 19th birthday and 2 weeks before his death. Clarence Whitaker pointed at Eddie's face in the photograph, and his old hand was shaking, and he said to Rachel, "That is your great-uncle Eddie. He had the kindest laugh of any man I've ever served with. He could imitate every officer in our battalion so well that we used to make him do it on the radio when the officers were not listening, and we would all laugh until we cried. He wrote letters to a girl back in Akron named Maureen who never wrote him back, and he made up replies from her that he would read out loud to us, and he made the replies funnier than the real ones would have been, and we told him the imaginary Maureen was better than the real one, and he should marry the imaginary one. He was 19 years old when he died. He died in the gunner's seat right next to me. The sniper's round hit him in the temple. He did not say anything. He did not have time to say anything. I held his hand for about 2 minutes after he died before we had to move the tank, and then I let his hand go and I took us out of that village, and I did not cry until that night, and then I cried for about an hour, and then I never cried about him again until last Tuesday morning, when I started the engine of a tank just like Hattie May at a museum in Bridgeford. I have carried Eddie Pavlovich in my pocket for 80 years, child, and now you are here, and I get to put him in your hands instead, and that is a gift I did not know I was going to get in this life. Rachel Pavlovich Sandoval stayed at Clarence Whittaker's small house until almost midnight that Saturday. They sat at his kitchen table and drank coffee and looked through the photograph album page by page, and Clarence told her stories about her great-uncle Eddie that her family had never known, the practical jokes Eddie used to play, the song he used to sing under his breath when he was nervous, the way he had once given his last chocolate bar to a French child in a village they had liberated in August of 1944, the time he had cried for almost an hour after they had found a German soldier the same age as himself dead in a foxhole with a photograph of a young woman in his pocket. Rachel listened to all of it with her hands wrapped around her coffee cup and tears running quietly down her face, and she did not interrupt, because she understood, the way the women in her family had always understood, that some men carry stories for a long time, and the kindest thing you can do for them when they're finally ready to tell those stories is to be quiet and let them tell. When Clarence had finally talked himself out, somewhere around 11:30 at night, he closed the photograph album gently and pushed it across the table toward Rachel and said, "I want you to take this. It belongs with your family, not with mine. Eddie was your blood. He was just a boy I served with. The album is yours now." Rachel started to protest. Clarence held up his hand. "Child, I am 80 years old. I do not have very many more years left in this life. The album is going to end up in a box in somebody's attic when I am gone. And the people who go through my things are going to look at it and not know who any of these boys are except for the picture of me, and they are going to put it in a box and forget about it. You will not forget. You will show this to your children someday. You will show it to Eddie's great-great-nieces and nephews. You will tell them what I told you tonight. The album goes home with you. That is final." Rachel took the album in both hands. She held it against her chest. She said, "Mr. Whittaker, I do not know how to thank you for this." Clarence looked at her across the table, and his pale, watery eyes were very kind, and he said, "Child, you have already thanked me. You drove 8 hours to a stranger's house in Tennessee to tell an old man that your family still reads a letter he wrote in 1946. That is the thank you. You did not have to bring anything else. Now drive safely back to Cleveland tomorrow. Call me when you get home. I do not own a cell phone, but I have a landline and I will be by it all day waiting for your call." Rachel nodded. She stood up. She walked around the table and she leaned down, and she kissed Clarence Whittaker on the top of his white head, and she said, "Eddie loved you. I know he did. I can hear it in every story you just told me. He loved you, and you loved him, and you took care of his memory for 80 years, and I am going to take care of it now, and you are going to be able to rest." And then Rachel Pavlovich Sandoval picked up her purse and her photograph album and walked out the front door of Clarence Whittaker's small house in Marlow Springs, Tennessee, and Clarence stood in the doorway watching her car back down the driveway and turn onto the street and disappear into the dark, and then he closed the door and he walked back into his living room and he sat down in his favourite chair and he closed his eyes, and for the first time in 80 years he let himself feel something he had not let himself feel since April of 1945, which was the simple, terrible, beautiful relief of having finally handed Eddie Pavlovich's memory to somebody who would carry it after he was gone. The Sherman tank at the County Military Museum in Bridgeford, Tennessee, ran perfectly at the Veterans Day open house 3 weeks after Clarence Whittaker started it for the first time in 8 decades. Gerald Pence and his volunteers, following Clarence's instructions exactly, had run the engine in short sessions every day for 2 weeks, gradually warming her up, gradually working out the kinks, and by the morning of November 11th she was rumbling along like a tank that had been operated yesterday instead of one that had been silent for 60 years. Clarence Whittaker was the guest of honour at the open house. He sat in a folding chair next to the tank in his denim jacket and his pressed khaki pants, and a small American flag pin on his lapel that his great-granddaughter Lily had given him for the occasion, and he answered questions from visitors for almost 3 hours straight, until his daughter finally insisted that he take a break and get something to eat. Lily, who was 9 years old and who had been taken out of school for the day specifically for this event, sat next to her great-grandpa for the entire 3 hours, and held his hand whenever he was not gesturing with it. And at one point a small boy about her age came up and asked Clarence if it was true that he had driven a tank in a real war. And Clarence said yes, it was true, and the boy asked if the tank had ever been shot, and Clarence said yes 6 times, and the boy asked if Clarence had been scared, and Clarence looked at the boy for a long moment and then said, "Son." Every single day. Every single minute of every single day. The men who tell you they were not scared in the war are lying to you. The men who were really there will tell you they were terrified the whole time, and that being terrified did not stop them from doing their jobs. Being brave is not the same thing as not being scared. Being brave is doing the thing even when you are scared. Remember that. It will be useful to you in your whole life, not just in war. The boy nodded very seriously. His mother, standing behind him, was crying quietly, and Lily, who was holding her great-grandpa's hand, looked up at him and said, "Grandpa, were you ever brave?" And Clarence Whitaker, 80 years old, looked down at his 9-year-old great-granddaughter and said, "Sweetheart, I tried to be. Some days I think I was. Some days I know I was not. Most days I was just doing my job and hoping that what I did was good enough. That is what most brave men actually do. They do their jobs and they hope it is good enough." Lily considered this very seriously for a moment, the way she considered everything seriously, and then she said, "Grandpa, I think it was good enough." And Clarence Whitaker, who had not cried in public in 80 years until the morning he started the Sherman tank, almost cried again, but he did not because Lily was watching, and he wanted Lily to see her great-grandpa being strong, and so he just squeezed her hand and said, "Thank you, sweetheart. That is the nicest thing anybody has ever said to me." Clarence Whitaker passed away peacefully in his sleep on the night of February 20th at the age of 81, in his small house in Marlow Springs, Tennessee, with his daughter Susan holding his hand and his great-granddaughter Lily asleep in a chair by the bed. He was found the next morning with a small black-and-white photograph in his right hand. The photograph was of 5 young men in tanker overalls standing in front of a Sherman tank with the name Hattie May painted on the side. Clarence had borrowed the photograph back from Rachel Pavlovich Sandoval for one night a week earlier, when she had visited him for what would turn out to be the last time, and he had asked her if he could keep the photograph by his bed for a little while, and she had said of course, and she had not yet asked for it back. Rachel was at the funeral. She drove down from Cleveland. She sat in the front pew with Clarence's daughter Susan and his grandson, and his great-granddaughter Lily, because Clarence had specifically asked Susan, in a quiet conversation a month before he died, to make sure that Rachel was treated like family at his funeral, because Rachel was the closest living connection Clarence had to a boy named Eddie, who had died 80 years ago in the seat next to him. The funeral was held at a small Methodist church in Marlow Springs, and the church was so full that people stood in the parking lot. Among the mourners were Gerald Pence and his 4 volunteers from the County Military Museum, who had driven down from Bridgeford in a single car. Travis was there, Bill was there, Eileen the docent was there, Walter Briggs the museum director was there in a dark suit. The photographer who had written the article was there with his wife, and in the very back of the church, a tall, thin man in a Sherman-era US Army tanker's helmet, the leather and cloth kind from World War II, hand-carried in a shoebox all the way from Phoenix, Arizona, stood quietly during the entire service. He was 91 years old. His name was Donald Skoglund. He had been the radio operator in the tank that Clarence Whitaker had reversed back into a kill zone to rescue in the Hurtgen Forest in November of 1944. Donald Skoglund had been wounded in that rescue. Clarence Whitaker had pulled him out of his burning tank under fire and had carried him on his back to the relative safety of a tree line. And Donald had spent 6 months in a military hospital and had never seen Clarence again, and Donald had spent 80 years trying to find him, and Donald had read the article in a Phoenix newspaper, and Donald had bought a plane ticket the same day. Donald Skoglund was the last man alive whose life Clarence Whitaker had personally saved in the war. He waited until everyone else had filed out of the church, and then he walked slowly up to the closed casket at the front, and he put his old, freckled, shaking hand on the polished wood, and he said, in a voice that nobody in the empty church could hear except him and the man inside the casket, "Whitaker, it's Skoglund. I owed you for 80 years. I'm sorry I didn't get here in time to say it to your face, but I'm here now. Thank you. Thank you for my life. Thank you for my wife, and my 4 children, and my 11 grandchildren, and my 6 great-grandchildren, and every breath I have taken since November of 1944. They are all because of you. I will see you on the other side, brother. Save me a seat in the tank." And then Donald Skoglund saluted the casket, slowly, carefully, with the deliberate precision of an old man who knows this is the last salute he's ever going to give to this particular brother. And he turned and walked out of the church and got in a rental car and drove to the airport and flew home to Phoenix, and he called his oldest son from the airport and told him the whole story. And Donald Skoglund's son, who was 63 years old and a retired schoolteacher, sat in his kitchen in Phoenix with the phone pressed to his ear and cried like a child, because his father had finally been able to put down a debt he had been carrying since before his son had been born. The Sherman tank at the County Military Museum in Bridgeford, Tennessee, has run for the last several Veterans Day open houses, and it will run for the next one, and the one after that, and the one after that, because Gerald Pence and Travis and Bill and the rest of the volunteers have made it their personal mission to keep that tank running for as long as the museum exists. There is now a small bronze plaque mounted on a post next to the tank. The plaque is hand-engraved and it reads, "In honour of Master Sergeant Clarence Whitaker, U.S. Army 743rd Tank Battalion, 1943 to 1945. She has been asleep for a long time and you have to wake her up gently." Below the plaque is a smaller line in italics that reads, "And in memory of Private Eddie Pavlovich, Akron, Ohio, 1925 to 1945, who is remembered. Visitors stop at the plaque every day. Some of them salute, some of them cry, some of them stand in silence for a long time and then walk away without saying a word. And every now and then a child will tug at a parent's hand and ask why somebody put up a sign for an old man who fixed a tank. And the parent, if the parent has been to the museum before, if the parent has read the story, will kneel down and tell the child the whole thing, from the beginning, slowly, the way important stories should be told to children. Because the lesson of Clarence Whitaker is not really about a tank, and it is not even really about the Continental R975 9-cylinder radial engine that he hand-cranked back to life on a Tuesday morning in October. The lesson is that the skills the world thinks are obsolete are almost never actually obsolete. They're just sleeping inside the bodies of old men nobody asks anymore. The lesson is that there is a quiet veteran in nearly every small American town, sitting in the back booth of a diner or at the edge of a museum crowd, who has carried a thing in his bones for 60 or 70 or 80 years that nobody around him knows about, and that the only reason he carries it in silence is that nobody has ever asked him the right question in the right way at the right moment. The lesson is that mechanical knowledge, like grief, like love, like courage, does not get smaller when it is left alone. It just waits, patiently, in the dark, until somebody who knows what it is reaches in and brings it out into the light. And the lesson is that the engines built by careful hands in factories in places like Muskegon, Michigan, in 1943 and 1944, and the men trained to operate them in places like Fort Knox, Kentucky, in the same years, were built and trained by people who understood that someday, 80 years later, in a small town in Tennessee, a 9-year-old great-granddaughter was going to want to see her great-grandpa be the coolest old man in central Tennessee, and the engine and the man were both going to be ready, because that is what real workmanship and real training are for. If this story moved you, if it made you think of a quiet old veteran in your own life, the one at the end of your street, the one in the back of your church, the one who never talks about what he did but who you have always sensed did something, please subscribe to the channel, because we tell stories like Clarence Whitaker's every week, and we believe, as Clarence believed at the end, that the men and women who served in silence deserve to be remembered out loud.